Okay, everyone, it's so fantastic to see, I'm going to say about 15 people in the room and then an amazing 56 people at home. I'm hoping not all of you have COVID. My name's Georgia Mason. I'm the director of the Campbell Centre for the Study of Animal Welfare, and it's my huge pleasure today to introduce you to Dr. Lotta Berg. Dr. Berg is a veterinary researcher from the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences in Skara. And what she's going to talk to us today is about compliance with animal welfare codes and regulation, because I think many of us aspire to see our work turned into legislation, because surely then it will make a difference, or will it? So let's hope it's not too dystopian today. Those of you in the room, feel free to crunch and munch and rustle and eat your lunch. Those of you online, obviously you can do whatever you like. And then at the end, this is a bit of a pilot for the hybrid seminars we're going to have in the fall. So what we're going to try is at the end, Zoomies, online people, we're just going to focus on you and your questions, and Dr. Berg will handle you. Then we will log out of Zoom and then we'll concentrate on the roomies. So it'll be Zoomies, then roomies, because the two audiences can never communicate. But everyone can talk to Lotta. Okay, without further ado, thank you.
Thank you very much. And then I'm doing this because I am slightly taller. And I will not be reading the chat whilst giving the presentation, because that is sort of too confusing. So if there's anything urgent in the chat, you let me know. Right. So this is me, and this is today's presentation. It's about, as sort of said, the compliance with animal welfare legislation and regulations, drivers and consequences for people to actually do what they're told. I work at, as you heard, at Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, where I'm a professor in animal environment and health, which means that I cover sort of all species, more or less, but I focus on farm animals. And lately I've been working a lot with animal welfare, slaughter and killing. But I also do other preventive veterinary medicine, herd health, etc. I'm also the director of the Swedish Centre for Animal Welfare, which means that I do kind of advisory service for the authorities, basically where we help and assist the competent authorities in the interpretation and application of the legislation on animal welfare. And this part where I've been working on compliance, I've done that together with one of my co-workers, Frida Lundemark Hedman, who did her PhD for me and still working at our department. So she should also be acknowledged in this. So what does compliance mean? What is it? Well, it's your mother tongue, not mine, but still, the way I use it in this presentation is that, well, we have regulations, but they're rather pointless if they're not complied with. Then they're just a piece of paper. So regardless of how well written or balanced or strict or flexible or mild a set of rules or regulations is, it will have little influence on the actual welfare of the animals unless the owners or caretakers actually comply with it. So the question is, to what extension are the rules complied with, and how can this be measured? And we did write a paper on this, as you can see on the screen, which is sort of the basis of what I'm going to tell you today. This is, you get the compliance for dummies now, but the short version of it, with some time for discussion afterwards. So why should we measure it? Well, the obvious answer is that to ensure that legislation or other standards is complied with and impose sanctions if not. But another point is that it should be fair to create a level playing field for the producers, so that if somebody says they're doing something, we should ensure that they are. And also ensure the consumers that sort of official legislation or private standards are efficient. I mean, you get all these labels with various animal welfare programs or schedules, but unless they're complied with, it's just a label without any content. So the consumers will be interested. And there's also the benchmarking side of it, where comparing farms or regions or countries, how well is, for example, in the European Union, where we are located, It's really, are all the different member states handling our common European legislation in the same way? Is compliance the same in Italy as in Denmark or in Estonia or not? And if so, why not? So there are several reasons for us wanting to measure compliance. And this is, as I said, not just legislation. I use the term legislation for anything that's issued by the government, where this is a formal system for enforcement. But then you have all the private standards, from organic to supermarkets, etc. Because we know that there are regional differences in the approach and preferences. We know that some countries are heavy on legislation, others are heavier on voluntary schemes or guidelines, both because the consumers have different preferences, or actually the citizens, the voters, but also because the industries might have chosen different paths. And a lot of, when I travel, which I do quite a lot, to different countries, wherever I come, farmers and or slaughterhouses will usually tell me that they've got the strictest legislation ever in any country on earth. And the worst inspectors, the most meticulous control, etc., etc. It may not be entirely true everywhere, and I don't think there is one country actually that it holds true for, because if you look at animal welfare, just the legislation, not to mention the private schemes, you will see that some will be stricter in some areas, and in other countries they will be stricter in other areas. And also compliance, again, will differ. And regardless, there's no point in having the strictest rules unless they're complied with. It may be good for your sales, but it's not really trustworthy in the end. So yes, so let's assume that this country X has the strictest rules. Well, let's start. If that's good or not, you can always debate, but let's assume that it's something to aim for from an animal welfare point of view. Then you get to the next step. What about the inspection of these rules? The control, the official control, or third-party audit, or whatever it is. Does the same country also have the most meticulous or fussy inspectors? And if so, if they complain about something, if they find errors at the farm, are corrections made? If not, it doesn't matter if the inspector is standing there complaining, if it doesn't result in an action and an improvement. And it's, as I said, it's unfair competition if some are forced to comply with the rules and others not. You can always discuss here what's the hen or the egg. What comes first? Do you need the inspection system first, or the regulations, or do you write the regulations in order to fit your inspection system, which can happen? Or do you actually write the rules to fit what's already being done, which is also happening, which is kind of a different issue, but I would just want you to bear that in mind. It's not as straightforward as you may think. Looking at the effects of regulations, there are some scientific studies being carried out in this area, and not just by me and Frida and our co-workers, but also others. And in general, it's shown that farmers actually believe that sanctions and incentives work. So both sanctions when you're violating the regulations, but also incentives in terms of being able to sell under a different label or being given a higher market price, etc. And that the systems do identify those colleagues, farmers, who are not doing a good job with their animals, which a lot of farmers would find beneficial, because they will not want to be associated with poor welfare because they're doing a good job themselves. Some farmers see a regulatory system, official or private, as a possibility to actually display their work, to show that they're doing a good job, to prove that they are working with the animals in a good way from an animal welfare point of view. But others dislike or disdain any type of inspection or control. So we get all these different answers if you ask farmers. There are studies showing that farmers that receive fewer comments or on non-compliance, or fewer remarks, are more positive to the animal welfare and control than those that do end up with a lot of complaints after an inspection, which makes sense to a certain extent, but it's not that simple. I'll come back to that. Because there are other studies showing the opposite, or rather showing that there is no correlation, like the one we just did. A study that we just recently published this spring with, again, me and Frida and some other people, where we're currently running a couple of studies looking at perceptions of animal welfare inspections, both using questionnaires, but also actually going out with inspectors, interviewing them before the inspection, interviewing the farmer before the inspection, and interviewing the inspector and the farmer separately after the inspection to see how they actually perceived it, what did they expect, did they have positive or negative feelings before the inspection and after. And we've just, so far we're only through the material for the horse trainers. So these are trotting horse trainers. Trotting is a huge sport in Sweden, where the trainers are, some of them are professional, they do this for a living. A lot of them do it sort of part-time, they've got another job as well. So in this case, and we're going to come back to the dairy farm owners, farmers, because they do differ quite a lot, these two groups. So the horse trainers were generally positive. They had a sort of a positive idea about having an official inspection and a private one, because there's a private system as well within the trotting horse industry. So they were generally like, yeah, okay, this is what happens. I'm fine with it, relaxed about it. And this positive notion was not related actually to the outcome of the inspection. Having said that, the private system for the horses was kind of a more of a, I wouldn't say body thing, but friendly. You could point at some things, but nothing much happens. And there was this guy who does the private scheme. He's really, which is the same person. He's an old trainer himself. He's very knowledgeable. He'll stand there and chat about the horses, etc. And if there's something really wrong, he points at it. But it's different. He's got a different task compared to the official control that has its own, with the legislation, and there's this checklist, and there's things to go through. But in both cases, actually, the horse trainers were generally positive, regardless of the outcome. And what they really all emphasized, or most of them emphasized, was the competence of the inspector, being it private or official. Now, of course, they don't know what training this inspector had, and they don't run them through a test when they're out at the farm. But it's a matter of being able to talk to the trainers in their own language, in a way, giving the impression, at least, that you're knowledgeable, regardless of the true fact, because that we don't know. But the perceived competence of the inspector is really important for the trotting horse owners or trainers to listen. When it comes to the dairy farmers, we've only started analysing that data, but I can tell you as much as we know that the dairy farmers are more afraid. They're a lot more negative already before receiving an inspection than the horse trainers are. And our hypothesis is that this is really related to the agricultural media, which tend to be very negative to the government and to inspections, and always writing about this poor farmer who now has to get rid of his cows because the ugly inspector was there, sort of. So they are probably not, I'm not sure that this notion is well based, but their impression is that, oh, there's got somebody coming from the government and they're going to close me down, which they are not normally, but still. So this is one of the aspects that is really important, and of course this preconception will make a difference also during the actual inspection, because if you're negative, you're waiting for bad things to happen, you will only hear bad things, or you will predominantly hear bad things. So this is something that is really a challenge to the industry, because with this negative expectations, it's actually negative for the farmers and the outcome if the farmer is really sort of passive aggressive from the beginning, because he usually is afraid. So this is really, there's a lot of psychology in this. And the horses one has been published. Of course, there are So I'll come back to the compliances. There are many different types of regulations. There is legislation, as I said. There are organic standards, which cover animal welfare, but also other aspects, as you know. There are different retailer or industry-owned animal welfare programs and standards, and so on. And in some countries, there are standards run by NGOs in animal welfare. So if people from, let's say, the farm is affiliated to a number of different schemes, which it can be, I mean, everybody's sort of affiliated to the legislation. You can't avoid it. But then you can also decide to produce organically, and you can sell to a certain supermarket chain, and then you end up with 3 different systems on the same farm. So if somebody's evaluating this particular farm for compliance, will these different inspections yield the same result? Nope, most likely not. Because first thing, the different regulations will have a different content. Some will focus on some aspects of animal welfare, another one may focus on other aspects. It's not just repeating the same areas. To a certain extent, yes, but not generally. So there are different rules, and then it's also a matter of how you classify compliance. Do you do it in a dichotomous outcome, such as totally compliant or not compliant? Or do you have a graded scale with partial compliance for some rules or for some animal categories or for whatever? I mean, the cows are compliant, the calves are not, or compliant at the 80% level, or there's so many different ways of doing this. And this is really something that's complicated because, I mean, when inspecting a farm, is the inspector or auditor expected to look at all the animals or just a sample? And if so, how is that sample of animals selected? Does it look good for most of the animals, but a few are not looking good? Is that compliant or not? Let's say that 80% are clean and in good body condition, whatever. Some are a bit iffy, and 10% are really dirty and emaciated. Is that compliant or not? And where do you draw the line? 1% emaciated, 5% emaciated, 10%, or wherever. So you're looking at the equipment, input-based measures like, okay, all the pens should have I don't know, for pigs, some kind of chewing material like straw. Okay, most pens had straw, some did not. Is that compliant or not? To what extent? Is it a non-compliance because you're failing 1 pen, or when you're failing 10 pens, or again, I hope you see my point there. I'll give you one example at the EU level, pig's tails, which is actually tourist speciality. The EU directive, which is to be implemented on all member states, says no routine tail docking. You get the full text there in the little box. It says neither tail docking nor reduction of corner teeth must be carried out routinely, but only when there is evidence that injuries to such teeth of other pigs' ears or tails have occurred. Before carrying out these procedures, other measures shall be taken to prevent tail biting and other vices taken into account, environment and stocking densities, etc., etc. So it's not a complete ban, but it's sort of, you're not supposed to do this unless there's really good reason and you tried everything else. Looking at what actually happens, you'll see that in Sweden and Finland, there is no tail docking. It does not occur. In other member states, it varies a lot. You will, in some areas, you'll find tail docking being carried out in violation of the instructions from the authorities. So that would be non-compliance, right? In other countries, you will see tail docking carried out with sort of the informal consent of the competent authorities. They will either say that, well, we don't like this, but we know you have to because you're going to export your piglets to Germany and they want them docked. So, okay, we don't see anything, we don't hear anything. And yet in other countries, you will have the government saying that, no, you really need to do this to comply with this. You're not supposed to dock tails. Whereas the local inspector will say, yeah, but I know it's really hard for you, John, you can't. Well, everybody else is doing it, so I'm not going to write anything about this non-compliance, okay? Is that a non-compliance or not? Because actually the representative of the competent authority said that it's not going to do anything about it. Is it really non-compliance if nobody detects it, if there are no inspections? It's sort of the Schrodinger's cat. If nobody sees it, does it happen? Or the authorities notices it, but doesn't do anything about it. There are no sanctions. So, not that easy to measure compliance, right? So why is there non-compliance? Now I'm talking in general, not just the pigtails. It could be pure ignorance, that whoever the farmer is unaware of the legislation or standards. He or she hasn't read it properly or hasn't sort of understood it. Or maybe there's a lack of motivation. The farmer knows what's in the legislation, but didn't understand the point of it. Finds it pointless, lack of knowledge on animal welfare. Why should I do this? It's just not relevant. There can also be a component of self-righteousness in this. I know this a lot better. I know my pigs or cattle better than any person behind a desk who's written a text, which is also an attitude that you may come across. There could be time constraints. The farmer wants to do it according to the legislation, but don't really have enough time and money or resources for animal management. There could be financial constraints. The farmer knowing that he or she should invest in better equipment, for example, or have more space in the pens, but there isn't enough money for investing or fixing these things. Pure greed is also an issue in some cases, where somebody just wants to make a lot of money without the necessary expenditure. It could be a personal inability to see what the animals need. I mean, there are people with mental health issues, addictions, alcoholics, drug addicts, etc., who are not even able to look after themselves, to take care of themselves, even less so properly look after the animals. And then there could be the general defiance. Again, I mentioned before, focus on ownership. These are my animals and nobody else should tell me what to do with them. So, and it could be, of course, a combination of several of these factors. So sometimes when we discuss compliance, we talk about different types, two different main types of non-compliances, one being the administrative non-compliances. Missing sort of paperwork, could be not having the necessary permits to keep this many animals, which will vary a lot between countries again, but in many countries there are limits to how many you can keep without a permit. Maybe missing a certificate of competence when you're working at a slaughterhouse, which is necessary in the European Union. A piece of paper saying that you've had a certain training and you passed the test. If you're working with live animals at slaughter. Could be deficiencies in record keeping and so on. So these are sort of the administrative non-compliances. And then you have the actual animal welfare non-compliances, where animals are truly in poor condition. The housing system or equipment is in poor condition or insufficient somehow. Severe overstocking. You can have direct animal welfare problems, animals being injured or ill and not properly being cared for by a vet or somebody else. General neglect. So these are sort of two different types of non-compliances. And you might think that, well, the second one is the one that really matters because it's about the animals. But to my experience, it's quite common to see that these two types are correlated. If the paperwork isn't done properly, if the planning isn't done properly, if the permits aren't there, quite often the animals are not doing that well either. It's not 100%. And the other way around, you can have people who do all the paperwork properly, but are not good at looking at the animals. But very often still, they are linked. So, measuring compliance. This is a tough type thing to do because you need to find indicators. You need to know what are you measuring. You can have a number of indicators. There isn't the gold standard one indicator. You always need to look at many things. Then indicators choosing can be management-based, looking at the routines and procedures at the farm. And I'm talking about the farm all the time, but this of course also applies to other types of animals, such as lab animals or companion animals. But where we are, especially with companion animals, routine inspections are very rare. So that's why I'm focusing on farms. They could be resource-based, looking at the equipment, the available space, feed quality, etc. Or animal-based, looking at the more of the outcome. What do the animals look like? And sometimes they're also labeled input or output based. These are different terminologies. Okay, so which ones do we choose for measuring compliance? Well, you got to start with looking at what does the standard say, whether it's legislation or a private standard. What's in is the regulation based on inputs or outputs? Does it say the animals are to be kept clean and fat or whatever, or in good condition? Or does it say that they should be given at least 4 meters square per pig or whatever it is? But it's not that simple, because even if you have an mainly input-based regulation, you can still measure it by looking at the actual state of the animals to a certain extent, and the other way around. So there's no direct correlation between having an input-based legislation and using input-based measurements, not necessarily, and the other way around. Most often inspection guidelines are focusing on the actual state of the animals, but also of course on the inputs or resources. But the proportion between these two can vary quite a lot between different regulations. And then you need to decide what is acceptable if you have a threshold. And animals should be kept clean. Yeah, well, how clean? 2.5, and 2.5 out of what? So it's really, setting a threshold is one of the most important things for measuring compliance. And it's usually, such figures are not given in legislation or in standards. They can be, but it's not that common. Sometimes it says like, yeah, stocking density, that's simple to measure, or the level of ammonia. Yeah, you have this gadget and you measure ammonia levels. But a lot of other things are not that simple. So how do you choose indicators? You can't measure everything. You'd be stuck on a farm for a week for inspecting it, and that wouldn't work. So how do you choose what to look at? What are the most important things to inspect and check? And of course, this is not just about science and the needs of the animals. This also relates to what's economically feasible, how time-consuming it is. What does science say about this? As this indicator, does it indicate good animal welfare prevention? Or is it just there to punish those who failed? Is it practically feasible to instruct? What values did the initiator, the owner of the scheme or legislation actually want to convey? So choosing what points to measure is really, really important, but very rarely described. You just, in many cases, you ask a scheme or legislators now, why are these rules here? And nobody will be, well, to protect the animals, of course. Yes. What? Why did you choose this given certain threshold or that specific indicator? And it's sort of, you often do not get that much of a straight answer, to my experience. So, and also you need to think about it. Is the aim of an inspection to measure compliance with the regulations or to measure the welfare of the animals? These are two different things. Because with legislation, what you want to do is to check quite often, is the legislation complied with? Can be sort of a tick box exercise. Or do you really want to see what the animals look like, which is something else, because a lot of the legislation is quite often input-based, although there will be output-based measures as well. If the aim is to measure the welfare of the animal, the actual outcome, is that the aim of the inspection? Is there a risk that you're actually losing the aspect of the legislation or whatever standard it is being based on trying to prevent animal welfare risks, which means that you're trying to make people do the good thing to avoid bad things from happening, not just punishing them when bad things happening. So that is one of the problems with the outcome-based approach, is that it's not really as preventive as the input-based approach, where you give people instructions on how to minimize the animal welfare risks. And this, of course, you need to think about when you decide how to measure compliance. And as I said before, the same rule can be measured differently in also in different standards. So maybe you have a point on cleanliness of the animals in the legislation and in the organic standard in whatever private standard there is. Maybe in the legislation it will say that you need to clean the pens every second week. It doesn't, I mean, just as an example. Maybe then in the organic standard it says that the pigs have to be clean. And maybe it says in the private standard that only 20% of the animals can be dirty. Okay, it's all about cleanliness, but you're measuring it in a different way. Where you're giving the legislation or the instructions in a different way, and you may also measure it in a different way. And if the regulations, being in the legislation or private, are imprecise or indistinct, using terms such as sufficient or whenever possible, like animals should be kept sufficiently clean. Yeah, I agree. But what is sufficient? And where do you draw the line? Is that up to the inspector, to the farmer? Who must decide? Or the noise level, this is from the Swedish legislation on a farm, may only temporarily exceed 75 decibel. Temporarily? Is that like an hour a day, an hour a week, 2 minutes when you run the cleaning system? This is also left a lot to what we call street level bureaucracy. What is actually the decision of the inspector? We should also keep in mind that the thresholds or limits given in a regulation, if there are figures, numbers saying that maximum this, minimum that, they're not based on animal welfare science only. Science can tell you that this stocking density will result in poorer welfare than that stocking density, if that is the issue, or that this ammonia level will be worse for the animals than that ammonia level. Certainly. But science can never tell you what's right. It can never tell you what's acceptable. That's an ethical issue, political issue. And of course, I mean, if you think about it, no animal welfare standard or legislation is ever written just based on animal welfare science, because it has to be practical and feasible and economic. I mean, if you just write it at a level that's sort of way up here, no farmers will actually farm because they will not pay. So there's always compromise with environmental issues, economy, workers' health and safety, traditions. This is how we usually do it in this country, right? Or this province or whatever. And other expectations. So that's part of it. You can always discuss whether the thresholds have been set to make it possible for as many producers as possible to actually comply, or if it's been set to sort of separate the good from the bad, or what was the idea when they wrote this legislation or standard. You can also have legislation and private standards that are sort of either very similar to legislation with just a different label, or you can have them at a higher level based on good practice. And then you'll have different kind of values. If the standard aims at something that is better than what we would call the shame level, which is the legislation that everybody actually has to comply with. That may be confusing to the farmer as well. Okay, that inspector said, I own 15 ppm ammonia is fine, but that guy said, it can only be 10. Why are they different? Isn't it the same animals? Yes, they are, but different standards may aim at different welfare levels. And then we have the next issue with group or individual level. Scientifically, animal welfare is a characteristic of the individual. I'm not less overheating because Turin's cold, or the other way around. We can, of course, if we're in the same room, we may influence each other, just like cows or pigs or whatever. But I don't feel happier because if I was a cow, I wouldn't be any happier if I was locked up in a pen indoors and the other half of the herd was outdoors. They don't really influence my welfare. But we tend to measure it at the group level for practical reasons. So does this mean that it's okay to treat the majority of the animals okay and then just forget the rest? You can't manage them all. Or do we actually aim at evaluating compliance at the individual level? And how relevant is then, yes, all these cats are perfect, but there's one that's really dirty because she's sort of the dirty pig who never learned where to lie down. Is that okay then, or not? Her welfare may be compromised, but actually the farmer has done whatever he can, or she. So what does the program say? And especially with voluntary programs, to my experience, they can be written at the individual level, but in practice, evaluation of compliance is almost always done at the group level in percentages. What does that do to our perception of animal welfare? And if there's a subsample ever being evaluated, how are they sampled? That makes it, if you're looking at like leg health in broilers, for example, if you look at the birds that will approach you, because they're the easiest ones to catch, are you getting a proper sample that's representative? Or the other way around, you're looking at the ones that don't move away when you're moving among them. That's not representative either. Then you get the poorest leg health ones. So that's really something that needs to be taken into account. So these are just some examples from guidelines that was saying that no more than 20% of the sows are allowed to be dirty. Yeah, what about the 20% that are? What do we do with them? Is that okay, or is it not? Or if 10% have foot pad dermatitis, yes, you manage you're compliant with the scheme, but what about the 10%? Are they still doing okay or not? Or mortality or whatever. The dead animals don't suffer, but they may have suffered before they died, so that is still a relevant indicator. So in summary, I know there's a lot of text on this one, but still, these factors will be affecting the results in terms of compliance levels reported. And I'm sure it's not a complete list, but at least it's a start. So, starting with the standard itself, what does it include? What does it cover? What aspects of welfare are included? Then the design of the control system. Who's making inspections? How often are inspections done? And how are they carried out? What indicators and thresholds are chosen? Are the inspections pre-announced or not? Or just announced very shortly before the inspector or auditor arrives? Is the choice of farms to be inspected random, or is it risk-based? For example, in the EU, they are increasingly asking for risk-based sample, where you look at the type of housing system or type of breed used or size of the farm or something, which may be and also previous non-compliances. And this means that if you use a well-designed risk-based system, you'll end up with a lot of more non-compliances because you will have chosen the worst farms for your inspection. That's probably the most efficient thing for animal welfare, but it doesn't look good in your stats, does it? So again, depending on the aim with the program is to show consumers that your farms are really good, then you're not going to do it risk-based that way. But if you really want to improve animal welfare, well, maybe you should. And of course, what instructions have the inspectors received? Do they have a checklist? Do they have a lot of information, or just these are the rules? Are they complied with? Yes, no. Their competence, as I mentioned initially, makes a huge difference. Is a farm affiliated to a voluntary program? Will that influence how well they also comply with legislation, the base level? Yes, most likely, according to our research. Those that also are affiliated to a voluntary program seem to be more motivated, more interested in their production, and hence comply at a higher level. There can be seasonal or regional differences depending on anything from the amount of rainfall to the type of soil, anything that may affect welfare indirectly. And how are non-compliance is reported? Is it rule by rule, and is it then related to the number of rules in a standard, or is it grouped like animal-based or related to housing, related to feeding, related to water, related to veterinary treatment, etc. There's so many different ways of reporting non-compliances. And then again, the definition of compliance. Again, where's the cut-off line? Where do you draw the line? So that is really, there are a lot of factors affecting the results in terms of the reporting of compliance levels. And then we haven't even talked about sanctions. I'm not going to focus too much on sanctions today. I'll soon wrap this up, but sanctions is part of it. It's part of the control system. And then you need to think about what sanctions are effective, dissuasive, and proportionate. That's what the EU legislation says that they should be. Easily said, right? But how do we know that the sanctions are proportionate? You don't want to over-punish somebody. But on the other hand, if you give them a little tiny fine, it's not going to make it, they'll just pay it and then go on the way they did. So that is a matter of finding a level where the sanctions are dissuasive, but not overly punishing. And then you can discuss, of course, are sanctions at all an efficient way of achieving compliance? Is the threat of sanctions efficient? In some cases, what about speeding when you drive? You know that you may get fined. People still speed, right? Or never in Canada, no. So depending on everybody's own perception, they may choose to comply, or they may do it because they have to, because it would be too expensive not to. Some kind of animal welfare non-compliance is if they're really like severe neglect, animal cruelty, you may end up in prison, but that's extremely rare. There's like one case every 5 years in Sweden. So yes, well, will sanctions improve compliance, or are other aspects more important? Is it more efficient to explain to people, for example, why is this rule here? What does it make to what does it do to improve the life of your animals? Or why is it important to the consumers who's going to buy your product? Maybe compliance, the sanctions are more important in affecting others than those that are really non-compliant. We don't know. This is an interesting area of research where and this is not just, of course, for animal welfare. This would relate to environmental crimes, health, safety crimes, etc. So this is not just animal welfare. So in conclusion, it's almost impossible to compare compliance between different animal welfare standards, countries, and species. I'm sorry, but that is my conclusion, because there's so many steps that you've seen through this presentation where differences can occur. But of course, in some cases it can be simple. If either there's a tail on the pig or it's not a tail. But if you're presenting figures and results on compliance, it's important to be clear and transparent about how the control of compliance has been carried, because otherwise you can compare apples and pears, basically, and that's not going to be useful. And another thing is sort of a side thing, but still that we realized when working on this, is that participation in a private scheme or private welfare program can be quite a useful complement to national legislation, but it doesn't replace it, because those farmers who are most likely to be non-compliant with legislation are not even members of the voluntary schemes. And that's it. Thank you.